Sanja Bojanić is a researcher immersed in philosophy of culture and queer studies with an overarching commitment to comprehend contemporary forms of gender, racial and class practices which underpin social and affective inequalities specifically increased in the current political contexts. She obtained an MA in Women's and Gender Studies and MA in Hypermedia Studies at the Department of Science and Technology of Information and a PhD degree at the University of Paris 8, processes that ultimately led to interdisciplinary research based on experimental media and artistic practices. She's Vice Dean for International Cooperation at the Academy of Applied Arts, where she's teaching, and the Executive Director of the Center for Advanced Studies for Southeast Europe, TAS-CE, at the University of Rijeka. And something which is not being read, but is very important for us, she is one of the friends in our board of friends, so the Group for Social Engagement Studies, one of the best friends, I would have to add. Okay. Sanja, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriana, comrade in the feminist cause, for inviting me to participate in the annual seminar on violence and critique, and thank you all for coming. The title of my talk, which is Rhetoric of Emancipation versus Rhetoric of Misogyny, already indicates my direction, actually. So it would be impossible to depict either emancipation or misogyny as such, even in a nutshell, for less than an hour. So today I will be dealing only with certain elements of linguistic ability or linguistic inability. The accent is on rhetoric and ways of articulating issues within emancipation and misogyny, as well as ways of transmitting publicly often burning and emotionally overcharged phenomena. I begin with language and a few elements of rhetoric, but move quickly on to the voice. I would like to say a few words about the public voice, the right to public voicing and expression of attitudes, thoughts, feelings, a recurring premise in the writing and debates around the thematization of emancipation. And certain technical details need to justify my title, for I will then move on to formulating a few questions. Emancipation, the negative phenomenon of misogyny, the moment, means and kinds of speech, position, declaration, proclamation, in which emancipation, but also misogyny, become instruments, actually, in various kinds of politics and ideologies. So the question with which I broach the whole subject is whether it is possible to think these two separately, and if so, under what conditions. The beginning will be, or the first element will be the enthymeme. Following Barbara Cassin and her remarks on the difference between the rhetoric of topos, as place or location, and the rhetoric of the kairos, which is the timing, from the Philosophical Lexicon Dictionary of the Untranslatable, when she comments and quotes first Plato's Gorgias and then Phaedrus, quote, "A good rhetoric still needs to be invented. That is to say, the dialectic, the art of dividing and gathering together. The rhetoric whose aim is not to persuade, but to elevate soul. An elaboration of good rhetoric consists in devaluating or even prohibiting a certain type of rhetoric in favor of another. Very often deprived of art and reason, allogon pragma, the rhetoric that should be devaluated deals with time and speech, hurried, extempore speech, improvisation, with inverted arguments as part of the rhetoric of kairos. And kairos is, of course, opportune moment. Good rhetoric, the other one, should privilege stability of meaning over the disruptive effects of the signifier, puns, So what is it that differentiates the opportune moment, this privilege of timing, which thus introduces contingency, and topos? What then is topos? Still, before we discuss topoi, I'm not imitating Aristotle by avoiding defining it. Let me first remind you that extensive passages on tropes and different figures of speech can be found from Book Gamma of the Metaphysics to Organon, and obviously in Rhetoric, interwoven with certain technical means of persuasion. So persuasion must rest on a method. We must know the reason why some things are persuasive and some not. Second, the speaker himself, here I leave to your imagination what would happen in the case of the feminine pronoun, must provide persuasion. Pre-existing facts such as oaths, witnesses, testimony, etc. are non-technical, since they cannot be prepared by the speaker. According to the author, a speech consists of three things: the speaker, the subject treated in the speech, and the listener to whom the speech is addressed. Only three technical means of persuasion are possible. Either in the character of the speaker, the persuasion is accomplished by character whenever the speech is held in such a way as to render the speaker worthy of credency, or in the emotional state of the hearer. The success of the persuasive efforts depends on the emotional disposition of the audience, or else in the argument, logos, itself. We persuade by argument alone when demonstrating or seeming to demonstrate that something is the case. Still, this is not all, for in the Aristotelian philosophical system, much attention is dedicated to topoi, though topos itself is not defined. So topos is a stoikeion, an element of the anthymemes. An anthymeme is what has the function of proof, apodeixis, or demonstration in the domain of public speech. Since demonstration is a kind of syllogismus, the anthymeme is said to be a syllogismus too. On the other hand, it is a short argument involving a paradox or a contradiction. Topos groups together multiplicity of anthymemes as the body of the proof, and is the strongest of rhetorical proofs. Nevertheless, numerous rhetoric manuals repeat the orator should avoid two tendencies in formulating anthymemes. One should neither deduce from far away nor take up everything. So this was considered fallacious until the 20th century. Today, or during this 20th century mass media event, this rule has been inverted. Fallacy description was associated with the alleged logical incompleteness of the anthymeme, its brevity, and the blistering impression it leaves, especially those visual anthymemes used very often and almost always in our days. Just about every TV commercial and print advertisement relies in some way on visual anthymemes. And I will remind you, I'm not here referring to subliminal messages, but the literal portion of the ad that directly contradicts the visual data. By offering products, we are also instantly provided by the great result of this purchase, the face cream that gives a middle-aged woman 20 years old of her age back. But also Trump's use of anthymemes. This list would be long and cover almost every statement he tweets. And this is not a talk on technical and historical details of rhetoric, so I'm just finishing that. I will just say not much more than that the Latin translation of topos is locus communis, and when we speak of a commonplace in English, one immediately thinks of cliches, banalities, and ordinary talking. Nevertheless, again, Aristotle thought of grouping anthymemes as a reservoir of premises in categories such as laws, witnesses, contracts, oaths, comparisons of similarity, difference, or degree, definitions of things, division of things, whole of parts, for instance, cause and effect, as well as other items that could be analyzed, researched, or documented. For him, these elements were essential in building the common ground of understanding and living. And in our present day, topoi became topics, themes of research, investigation, and rely on documents, spheres of interest. So my second element now will be on public voicing and who is behind it. In her 2014 London Review of Books lecture, The Public Voice of Women, Cambridge classicist Mary Beard begins with a story from the very beginning of the tradition of Western literature, and its first recorded example of a man telling a woman to shut up, as her voice is not to be heard in public. So Beard reminds us that the Odyssey is just as much the story of Telemachus, the son of Odysseus and Penelope. It is the story of the growing up, of coming of age, how over the course of the epic, Telemachus matures and emancipates himself from boy to man. Mary Beard writes, so the process starts in the first book with Penelope coming down from her private quarters into the great hall to find a bard performing to throngs of her suitors. He is singing about the difficulties the Greek heroes are having in reaching home. She isn't amused, and in front of everyone she asks him to choose another, happier number. At which point young Telemachus intervenes. Mother, he says, go back up into your quarters and take up your own work, the loom and the distaff. Speech will be the business of men, all men, and of me most of all, for mine is the power of this household. And off she goes back upstairs. Beard gives us a linguistic clue as to the significance of the actual words Telemachus uses. When he says speech is men's business, the word is mythos, and doesn't have today's meaning of myth. Or to interject for a moment, maybe it is exactly myth, legend, fiction, illusion, fake news, all of which refers to our present. However, Beard continues, in Homeric Greek, mythos signals authoritative and influential public speech, not the kind of chatting, gibbering, or gossip that anyone, women included, or especially women, could do. Men's speech is constitutive for the community, and it is most evident that it is the very representation of the supremacy in the household, but also in the state, the polis. And this pattern has recurred through history. Never have women had the kind of ready-made place in which they felt powerful as women. It was always necessary to struggle for that specific place or achieve it through arduous trial. Literally or symbolically, from Lysistrata to Echo, mutilated and punished for speaking Io, all the way to Shakespeare's Lucretia or Lavinia. Then Beard writes, public speech was if not the defining attribute of maleness. A woman speaking in public in most circumstances, by definition, is not a woman. What kind of a masquerade is going on here? It becomes a priori evident that the act of conquering a place, the place for public speaking, and I could easily use the word topos, but is this time a female topos, and its central point is yet to be achieved. Yes, there have been great female figures in history, but I would not be alone in saying that their serenities never had anything of a female topos to them or to others. Beard's example is the obvious case, Elizabeth I's bellicose address to the troops at Tilbury in 1588, before facing the Spanish Armada. These words are taught and learned at many English schools. Elizabeth I seems to be positively awoke to embrace her androgyny. I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. An odd slogan to teach young boys and girls, especially girls. In fact, and here Baird continues her sharp critique by revealing the trickery at play, it is quite likely that Elizabeth I never said anything of the sort. There is no script from her hand or that of her speech writer, no eyewitness account, and the canonical version comes from the letter of an unreliable commentator with his own axe to grind, written almost 40 years later. So yes, we are facing a much more complex phenomenon, allowing us to finally approach public voicing, public speaking of what I call female topos, and I was checking yesterday if female topos was used in any sort as a syntagm, and find out that Naomi Shore chose it also in the portrait of a gentleman representing men in French women's writing. So the context of her text is slightly different, but if I tell you that it deals with an exhibit held in London in 1980 and that aroused enormous controversy and attracted recorded attendance, it will become obvious why I'm referring to female topos in the framework of the male gaze onto the woman. The title was Women's Image of Men. My third element is then French Revolution. By sketching in broad strokes how a private life of a few exceptional men and women wins over the public tribunes and squares in the decades before and in the first years of the French Revolution, as well as what awakens the need for institutionalization of visceral resistance to the occupied public topoi, it would be possible to conceptualize the parallel phenomenon of politics of emancipation, designated above all the achieving of a female voice. I deliberately do not speak about the right to vote, but a space in which the female voice can be heard, and the politics of misogyny. Politics. So the central thesis of this presentation, or the motivation to engage with a certain genealogy of some elements of rhetoric, rests precisely in the claim that the hard thought place of the public female voice, which certainly belongs to protocols and politics of emancipation in a very odd and perverse way, also corresponds to publicly articulated address, either covertly or bluntly misogynist. The intensity of such public address differs and is conditioned by the political and economical context, as well as not necessarily being causal. On the one hand, as in a puzzle, it would be possible to enumerate the misogynist figures among philosophers, writers, scientists, that is, exceptional individuals who left their mark in myriad areas of human activity. On the other, one notices the expanded cultural trend of various forms of sexism. However, the varying element of the seesaw between the stronger and weaker revealed misogyny in a way depends precisely on the universal strength of emancipation and the moment when in certain mechanisms the emancipatory dynamics lapses into its own restrictive and polarized trends. But before I develop this claim further with some examples, let me say together with Kate Millett that except independently and as a given, misogyny, both traditionally and from the dictionary, is both a cause and result of the patriarchal system. I will not even wade through the analysis of interiorized and individual motives, nor am I focusing on the phenomenon of hate, intolerance, or fear of the female, taken as an other form of phobia. Traditional misogyny might be in the same tier with misandry, misanthropy, intellectual cynicism, or anthropophobia. If it manifests at a distance and precisely or seemingly benevolently differentiated from sexism and other forms of sexual harassment, this would be an exclusively individual and ineffectual misogyny, or else limited and short-lived. However, in order to thematize misogyny that is devastating and disruptive to the community, I ought to first say a few words about the treatment of the women's question. That is to say, I ought to connect the women's question with the motive of female topos, the subject of various politics and ideologies since the French Revolution to the present day, but simply not politically or ideologically formulated before that. So the rhetoric of misogyny does not rest only and exclusively on inventiveness of individual reasons of one person, but in the attempt to establish a specific form of universally restrictive normativity. In order to explain my claim, I will use two historical episodes to show the parallel struggle processes surrounding the emancipation of the female question and their restrictive opposition. It is established to the point of cliché that women en masse prepared and supported the French Revolution as early as the salons of the Ancien Régime, as well as then spoke such women as Olympe de Gouges, Madame Roland, Madame de Staël, Madame Clément Emery, from public pulpits and in revolutionary clubs, advocating its values. Still, by 1793, women were expelled from debate clubs, as well as the military, and in 1804, with the Napoleonic Code, they lost their hard-won status as citizen. Very good, 4 years. Thanks to one global historical event, as the historian around Patrick Boucheron at the Collège de France are calling the Revolution of 1789, in a very short span of 4 years, women, shoulder to shoulder with men, were active in the public sphere. In the words of Geneviève Fraisse, the French Revolution simultaneously allowed and prevented the presence of women in public as well as in civil society, while after the Revolution they unambiguously lost their political status, once again becoming, in the civil sense, subjugated. As the first secretary of the Assemblée législative of the French Revolution, in 1791, Marquis de Condorcet, philosopher and mathematician, was mainly focused on the quest for a more egalitarian society. This led him to think and write about a radical proposal of equality of women in the revolutionary context. So in 1790, he published De l'admission des femmes au droit de cité, on the admission of women to the rights of the citizenship, in which he strongly advocates women's suffragette in the new republic, as well as the enlargement of the basic political and social rights to include women. Rejecting biological determinism, Condorcet identified education as crucial to the emancipation of individuals. I believe, I quote, "I believe that all other differences between men and women are simply the result of education," he wrote in his essays in the philosophy of humanism. Dedicating a whole chapter of feminism is for everybody to feminine masculinity, a concept partly supported by Condorcet's ideas, Bell Hooks saw Condorcet as an author who wrote about the new models of self-assertion that do not require the construction of an enemy other, be it a woman or the symbolic feminine, for them to define themselves against. Almost simultaneously, however, Sylvain Maréchal, whom the history of 19th century social movements remembers as the progenitor of anarchism and atheism, as evidenced by his support for François-Noël Babeuf, 1796 Manifeste des Égaux, the Manifest of Equals. Shortly before his death in 1801, edits his Projet d'une loi portant défense d'apprendre à lire aux femmes, draft for a law prohibiting women from learning to read, addressing women with the following words. I'll read it only in English. If we ban you from the tree of science, regret not your sweet ignorance, guardian of virtue, mother of pleasure, to innocent babes dedicate your leisure. The introduction of this example of the female topos tells us that we are indeed dealing with, on the one hand, a normative introduction of women into the space of public speech by Condorcet, as well as its prevention from the extremely militant and unyielding Maréchal. It is further an issue of literal thematization, the creation of space in which female public voicing will take place, the possibility of a, as I said previously, ready-made public space wherein a woman, prior to any form of feminism, could be heard and develop specific yet universal politics of equality. When Sylvain Maréchal answers Condorcet's suggestion, project of law, he merely points out that it is ludicrous and insane to further speak of equal education for women. The implication begins that there are much more urgent matters of poverty and social oppression. His rhetoric is still private, although moved into the sphere of those same enthymemes of quick pass over the argument by reduction. So the topology or structure of forming new commonplaces of social justice and equality, from here, this example, thus acquired the fundamentals of a traditional understanding of formation of certain topics, but also inherited a private misogyny, adopted through the back door onto the Republican and later democratic discourses, perpetuating discrimination. A discourse of the more important truth and more urgent social themes regarding all, in a very brief argument sequence, thus becomes authoritarian discourse, drawing on this urgency to fulfill the invectiveness and ad feminem comments, not ad hominem, about private place, such as the already mentioned Telemachus words. The myth is formally and rhetorically maintained, smuggling the figure of the women, such much as that of the black or disabled or anyone less than whole, as a scapegoat. I don't know if you saw the new Yorgos Lanthimos film Killing of the Sacred Deer, but this film also very nicely depicts that practice of sacrifice. It is truly not important that Maréchal is an incredibly militant fighter for equality among people, just as it is not important for some leftists today that they are leftists and engage in critiquing capitalism while still engaged into hidden or open misogynist rhetoric. Marshall's anarcho-utopian example moves in the direction of indicating public and revealed discourses of misogyny we still encounter to this day, from right to left on the political and ideological spectrum. Without mentioning names, but I will still name it, but since we have spoken last days about Balibar and Wallerstein, I could easily place Balibar's discourses of emancipation alongside Badiou's discourses of emancipation, and the difference would become conspicuous. Since it is not my goal to be polemical within already established political spaces, let me return once more to the more important aspect of the struggle for female topos, both symbolic and literal, and the women's question. I would like to recount another historical event, and perhaps together we can look at its consequences and potential parallels with what we are now living through. The 19th and 20th century, and then Adriana can help me in this 19th century, they were replete with struggles of myriad public forms of the women's question, and many articulated it and placed it into specific historical contexts. The emancipation struggle at the beginning of the 20th century, which was the common denominator for all forms of feminist engagement, was constantly on the razor's edge, either emphasizing or denying biology, that is to say, physiology. There was at once a multiplication and the fragmentation of ideological and political reasons of both progressive forces and those who sought to conserve patriarchal values. When woman was sometimes idealized and romanticized at the very incarnation of virtue and pacified heaven for maleness, other times she was brutally blamed for disturbing the established system of values. In a way, this narrative from the end of the 19th century is resurrected in spite of legally and formally acquired rights within Western democracies. Once again, ideologies are being honed for a battle for the women's question and female topos, as well as the question of emancipation, especially through the paradoxes of politics of identity. Along with the development of the discourses about various forms of civil freedoms, there is also the contrary tendency, denying the need for separating the women's question, whether in the direction of universalization and rights of men, following the Enlightenment path of the first revolutionaries, or the entirely traditional and theological models, counter-revolutionary motives seeking a return and preservation of women to the sphere of the private. Consequently, parallel with all feminist and emancipatory movements, however different or holding disparate positions, there is the organization of informal or anti-feminist movements. So the strengthening of the first often provokes or feeds various mechanisms of emergence and resilience of these others. And I will end with another episode, which I called the ultimate duel. The March 19, 1911 issue of the Chicago Tribune carried an item originally reported by the Heidelberger Zeitung from January 15. An unpleasant event disrupted the peace of the old University of Heidelberg. The casus belli was the women's question. During a lecture, the private docent, Arnold Ruge, claimed that the new women's movement is advocated by spinters, widows, and barren women. In the audience was Mrs. Weber, researcher and wife of a university professor. She stood up, demanding that Professor Ruge retract his statement. Ruge justified his position, saying that he was speaking in general of the movement itself, while Mrs. Weber replied that only an idiot could offer up such an excuse. Since Mr. Ruge held no insult higher than the one uttered, he turned at once to Professor Weber, also in the hall, asking whether he agreed with the statement of his wife and demanding, because Max Weber, of course, accepted Marianne Weber's statement. So Ruge demanded to seek right away a duel second. Max Weber accepted the challenge, so the duel took place. The Chicago Tribune reported on the episode as if about duels, rather widespread in the German academic milieu at the turn of the 20th century. The newspaper did not present Marianne Weber and the history of animosity caused by debates about the women's question in Germany at that time. So the English version of the news does not carry the complete statement by Ruge, who also adds Jews to his sequence, because I read it in German, nor that he had previously also claimed that the women's movement certainly does not count among its members mothers and women filled with motherly duties. Just a few more words about the context. Arnold Ruge was the president of the Heidelberg-Mannheim branch of the Deutscher Bund gegen die Frauen-Emanzipation, German Alliance Against Women's Emancipation. And this episode in Heidelberg illustrates the beginning of the debate, but also the protracted legal battle, which does not end until 1920, when Ruge's license to teach at the university is revoked due to open anti-Semitism, hopefully. In addition to Max Weber, one of the witnesses at the trial was Karl Jaspers. Ruge was one of the first to become a National Socialist in 1923, returning to the university in 1938, of course. One of the founders of the Alliance for the Family of German Family and People Power, as well as fierce proponent for the preservation of the 3 Ks, Kinder, Küche und Kirche, kids, kitchen and kirche. A real and good woman is the epitome of beauty, generosity, humility, approachability, and boundless love. The woman's world centers on preservation of heart and home, that is to say the family, and unreserved sacrifice for the goal. All public activities, be it charity or social work, are allowed provided they do not infringe on familiar harmony. It is quite obvious that this idealized and objectivized idea of women bears no relation to reality. I remind you, Weimar Republic, and certainly not the reality, today's reality. So there is no need to continue this listing. These realities that we are living in Serbia and Croatia, United States, Yemen, China, and Morocco. It seems that despite all these guises, we still live in this Telemachus mythos. And then just to end as a recourse to duel in defense of honor and ideas, lest we forget, in the Magic Mountain, Thomas Mann presents to the inexperienced Hans Castorp in similar fashion the conflict of the totalitarian NAFTA and the encyclopedist Settembrini, means that this theatrical defense and mise en scène deepens aggressive impotence, so too the rhetoric of romantic logic of relation between sexes acts as the glue in anti-modern fictions. Thank you.
I just whispered that I myself have enjoyed very much in this lecture, and I hope it's the same case with all of you. I cannot not think whether Weber did the good thing to accept the duel instead of forcing his own wife to be part of the duel.
She would be ready to.
Yeah, she would. I guess she would, but now I'm not. Yes. Giving you the floor, please.
Thank you. It was really interesting on various accounts. I raised my hand because I want to follow up from what she said. So my question is profoundly non-academic, but yet not unserious. Disregarding Weber, what he did, how would you reply today? Imagine some kind of similar situation and me challenging better to a duel over something that you said, or or something that you caused. So how would you respond? Would you say, leave him and my kids and fight like a man with me, and it's an interesting question.
It is.
100 years after, what kind of response would be appropriate? Or you would say, the duel is it's a part of misogynist rhetorics. I'm not going to engage in that kind of rhetoric. Can you escape it or not? So, yeah, there are various types of possible responses. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Because what I thought when I firstly read about the duel, I was quite amused, because that's a beautiful episode. But I would rather put it somewhere in 13th, 14th century, and then all that comes with the knights and ladies, and the context might have been different. And then I also wrote pieces on courteous love, so that was something not so far from what I have in imagination as well. And you remember this piece I wrote about amour courtois, when a woman is actually responding in a very beautiful way to certain challenges she was confronted to. So I'll probably accept the duel, and most probably fight as a woman with women norms, and yeah. So I'm here with Monica Cano-Abadia, who actually can witness, and she's one who led feminist self-defense classes in Rijeka. So you see, it's not something strange to our gender.
Also, it's interesting that it's a very aristocratic ritual.
Sure.
which
we should abandon in terms of aristocracy, if not in terms of gender.
In terms of recognition, it's a very, okay, I don't know.
No.
In terms of recognition, it's a very interesting thing. I'm trying to differentiate. I mean, I cannot challenge a peasant to a duel.
That's it.
A peasant
That's it.
cannot insult me by his status. So he asks Weber if you agree, and then Weber is liable because he agrees, but yet there is this recognition of a possibility of a woman to intellect you, to offend you, to on the ground to challenge a duel. So that's like there is quite an emancipatory element to that. That's why I asked, would you take it? You obviously would. You do self-defense classes, and you're not.
But not only on that level, because it's really an episode. But the fact that Karl Jaspers was witnessing during the trial after the duel also tells us a lot about the context and ways they were dealing with such phenomena. It was not only Max Weber who responded to the duel of Ruge, but it was really a common thing at that time. No question?
I would, Georgia, please.
So, I think that, it's fascinating what you're talking about. So on one hand, you're talking about women's arms, and so I would just like you to elaborate a little bit about what exactly do you mean? Female tapas, yeah. But the second question has to do with this. So on one hand, we have misogyny, emancipation, But I think that there is an emerging third rhetoric that is quite interesting, and so I don't know how you would disconnect, what would you do with that? And this is the rhetoric of political correctness.
Sure.
So what do we do in that setting, and can we, within the discourse, the rhetoric of political correctness, distinguish that easily which one is misogyny, emancipatory, and which one opens to the female tapas or not?
Great question, because actually what I think is that political correctness introduced the very possibility of having misogyny in the public sphere. I'm not talking here in causal terms in any sort of it, but being politically correct made us enter things, as I say, and I tried to analyze it through rhetorical figures, things that were not being said before. Trump is too easy to analyze. It's too easy to analyze because he's openly what it is. And before that, we had this kind of speech disguised in political correctness, because we won this right to vote. We won. When I say we, I do not consider women and men. I consider all of us who are for equality in all terms. So, normatively speaking, we had it. We have laws in Serbia and Croatia, but they're not respected. And you have these rhetorics, and they are just smuggling like Sylvain Maréchal smuggling the ways. He was extremely important figure. You cannot even imagine. He's really one of the most important figures for social movements, so pre-utopian, pre-socialist, before Fourier and others, and is considered as such. And when you read his suggestion of law, that's incredible. And he died by natural causes, and Condorcet was guillotined. So that's also something. Those who were the first revolutionaries, who wanted to go smoothly and who wanted to be, Condorcet was against the guillotine of the king, so he was like moderate nowadays. And he was guillotined. And he was the guy who really thought against Rousseau, because in Rousseau you have a lot of misogyny as well. And what I wanted with these examples, not only telling you historical facts and truths, and but I just wanted to propose you in a plastic way how things are forming, how they're modeling these discourses. Because, of course, and I had a lot of things to say about politics of emancipation, and I can quote Rancière, and I could quote many people who wrote about it and thematized it, but I wanted to see what was it at the root of the very discourse, and somehow maybe it's too strong as a argument, but somehow I think that the public speaking of emancipation or defending the cause made at the same time for women made possible public misogyny. Mm-hmm. So that's I don't know if it was clear from what I wanted, because you have so many things now written about misogyny on multiple levels, and that's not all. Embracing the surface all the time, and not digging into why misogyny and why publicly now. Mm-hmm.
Actually, what is the comment that is? I wanted to follow up on what you just said about about speech, it's about discourse.
Sure.
Much more than speech. And in terms of speech and words and political correctness, I think the good things political correctness did is made us aware of some words, made us think of why some words are not appropriate. But in matters of discourse, in matters of thinking about notions and relations, it actually kind of made us think, made the world think through cunning strategies of saying inappropriate things in a way that is acceptable, right? So now we are faced with devising new, more cunning strategies to deconstruct that. But another thing I wanted to ask you is that I recently was in Stockholm at a conference, and the keynote was given by Agnieszka. She writes about anti-genderism.
Aha, good. Yeah, because Poland is extremely...
Yeah, but she's not writing only about Poland. Poland is the center of her attention. But she gave a really good presentation on anti-genderism as a global movement that is happening ever since. She was trying to connect different discourses from scholars, from hope, from politicians, and she wants to argue that it's not just a trend, it's a movement, that it has its agenda, to treat it as a movement. But then someone asked, because she was also presenting obviously in the context of general retraditionalization of society and everything. So there was a comment from the audience, and the guy asked whether she thinks that anti-genderism is part of this wider rise of populism, of right-wing nationalism. Is it just a part of this trend, or is it a separate thing? Is gender, or actually he asked whether gender is in the center of attention, or is just one of the aspects of this right? And she said something that I don't quite understand. I wanted to comment on it. She said, well, she said, I think in Poland it's in the center. I don't know about the world, but I want to think it is because I'm a gender scholar. And I want to make it center. I would like to give you a better argument because I'm a gender scholar. So I was thinking whether this is a good approach or not. I mean, generally, whether this kind of thinking is fruitful or not. And what would you think about her comment, and what would you think about anti-genderism? Is it the thing, or is it just one of the things?
Well, it's hard to comment what I didn't hear, but it's in a sense what I got from you. It's something that I'm aware of for almost 15 years now, and as I lived in France and then in Croatia, it's also a Catholic country, so it's absolutely a movement, and it started actually in 1995 with the even before, with the Pope John II, and his encyclics about the preservation of the family, and all civil society. I'm going to speak of Croatia, for example. Željka Markić, and all civil society is just reproducing this Opus Dei agenda clearly and with no political correctness. And what they do is that they are forming a European network of anti-gender politics. And what I learned in France also, and what Eric Fassin also wrote a lot about it, it's structured, it's clearly politically formulated, and it's not at all a civil society that is just reacting onto the reality, social reality, or whatsoever. So there is an agenda, and it's definitely something that is spread carefully, and what I witnessed at the beginning when it started, we were like discussing, are we going to respond to this? Because, and this is also what Judith Butler would say, this is not one gender theory. There is no one theory. There is no one approach. It's the richness of these approaches is that actually they are parallel and complementary, sometimes contradictory. What in queer we have also. So it's not homogeneous, and it's not reproducing homogeneous discourse, and that's the problem. Are we going to respond? Because we are just missing the target. We do not consider gender theory as a unique, as a homogeneous. So we are missing the target if we respond as such. We are going to be recognized as such. It's a tricky, because if you respond from the plurality of things, and in most of the cases it's the case, the response to anti-feminism is like that, then you are more into the debate. And if you are just defending yourself or trying to formulate or establish one theory, then you're against your own dynamics of thinking.
If there is no...
I just have one short comment.
Okay.
Because this is very intriguing. How to respond, how to delegitimize such movements when you are like speaking from a position of heterogeneity.
Yes.
Well, there is this interesting kind of fusion that movements like anti-gender, I guess, are trying to make, and that's the kind of, they want to hijack the rhetoric of pluralism. They want to present themselves as liberal, so they try to make some strange kind of amalgam between, on the one hand, majoritarianism, and on the other hand, the rhetoric of the open society, because they're strong anti-communist as well. So you can beat them with their own weapons to some extent. You can say, well, if you are for an open debate, then why do you want to push this outside of the debate? You can turn the argumentation around, I think, to some extent. Nevertheless, they want to kind of strengthen their legitimacy through recourse to pseudo-universalist knowledge. Very often, if you look at their discourse a little bit, of course they are not coherent, that's the point, they don't try. But when they are kind of grasping for these concepts, pseudo-universalism, then you should exploit that to the best.
She can answer her name.
No, it was a comment.
Okay. I didn't hear from here very well.
I just wanted to ask, what do we do now from the left with all? Sorry, with I was focused. Yes. What do we do now from the left with all this maréchal that we have? Because it's plagued. I'm very involved in activism in Spain, and I'm surrounded by maréchal. So what can we do when the anti-feminist discourses come from the mainstream right wing? It's easy to target them, even to combat them. It's very easy. But what do we do when the anti-feminist discourses come from our colleagues and comrades? So how do we navigate this problem?
And not only from activism.
Yes, but you know that I cannot answer you. I mean, it's so complex, and it all depends on the priority. What Maréchal was arguing, he discussed the priority thing, and he said poverty is more important than women's rights, and then we got the other answer. We invented intersectionality.
Or kako se zovu, self-consciousness raising groups.
Self-consciousness raising groups.
I have the feeling that we are stuck in that moment. Like we are again and again repeating that situation. We are militants on the left. The left doesn't care about women's problems because there are economic problems that are bigger and more important. So our struggle is like partialized. It's a partial struggle. It's less important. So we have to organize ourselves separately, and that's regarded as something that is bad, but we are kind of forced to do it. And then we raise this consciousness in groups, and we repeat again. So I think we're stuck on that dynamic. So yeah, just to drop, how can we unstuck ourselves from those dynamics in the left?
You can answer.
No, I cannot, of course. Yeah, but it's a funny thing. I mean, I also wrote down what you said. It's a wonderful phrase. Also, discourse of a more important truth. Mm-hmm. You hear it on the right. You hear it on the left. You hear it in the center. You hear it everywhere. It's mostly universal things that you can hear. And then what is the reaction to that? You have angry women who cook coffee or who print things, and then you get consciousness raising groups and radical feminism all over again. Sure. And that's emancipation plus misogyny. It's exactly what you. And
that's why I put bell hooks. It was not like I wanted to put her, but then.
No, but it's also. Are we really emancipated, and are we also self-misogynist? Whenever we encircle ourselves in small rooms where we exclude other people.
There is a paper.
Women are nodding.
There is a paper of Susan Gubar, and she. It was in late 80s. She wrote a paper on Mary Wollstonecraft as a self-hatred. Anti-misogynist. Like Mary is a misogynist as well, in a sense.
I wanted to, if I can, is there a hand? Okay, then I'm ignoring your hands, and I just want to say that apart from discourse of a more important truth, female topos, which is a wonderful phrasing, apart from Naomi Shore, there is the third one that I want to emphasize, and which I think is very important in terms of critique and violence, and this is less than whole. You didn't elaborate that one, sure. But you said women, blacks, and disabled. Yeah. Less than whole is not only wonderful phrase, but it's very in this humanism, anti-humanism debate, which is still with us, and sure. Anthropocene and everything, blah blah blah. Yeah. I think it's a. Can you say more about that one, because it's a very precise one?
Because I read Aristotle, Rhetorics, and I went through fallacies, and that's the one. I mean, in developing argumentation, that's what you have. Anthememe is really something so spreaded and so obvious to all of us, but it's far from right, or like, less than whole. It's this is it.
So the wholeness is the new black.
Sure.
Wholeness.
The wholeness.
We can use this argument for 2018, definitely. Okay. Is there another question, comment, or are we going to be festive now? Having a party. If that's how it is. Then Sanja, thank you very much for bringing a female topos. I promise that it's going to be present more in the next year. Great. Now, thank you. Thank you.